Good afternoon and welcome to This Week in Turkey. In his parliamentary group meeting speech on Tuesday, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan said that the murdered Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi was the victim of a ferocious and premeditated killing.
President Recep Tayyip Erdogan said on Tuesday that the killing of Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi was ferocious and demanded Salman bin Abdulaziz Al Saud to extradite those who killed him to stand trial in Turkey. A team of Saudi agents began arriving in Turkey the day before the journalist's savage killing, and cameras at the Saudi consulate in Istanbul were removed, Erdogan said, speaking before Parliament. Intelligence and security institutions have evidence showing the murder was planned. Pinning such a case on some security and intelligence members will not satisfy us or the international community, he said. Erdogan, who said the issue of diplomatic immunity would also be discussed in regards to the case, was speaking at a meeting of his Justice and Development Party AKP in the parliament. He had previously promised to detail Turkey's investigation of the case. Why did these 15 people meet in Istanbul on the day of the murder? We are seeking answers to this. Who are these people receiving orders from? Erdogan said, referring to the Saudi team of 15 who entered the consulate the day of the killing on October 2nd. 3 men from the team went on an exploration trip to the Belgrade forest in Istanbul and Yalova, a 90-kilometer drive south of Istanbul. Erdogan's speech came as the Saudi Foreign Ministry released extraordinary photos of Khashoggi's son, Salah bin Jamal Khashoggi, meeting the Crown Prince and King in Riyadh on Tuesday. Erdogan described the murder as ferocious and called on the Saudi king to extradite all 18 suspects so they can be tried in Istanbul.
During a visit to Turkey this week, CIA Director Gina Haspel reportedly heard an audio recording of the killing of Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi.
CIA Director Gina Haspel has listened to an audio tape of Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi's interrogation and murder during a visit to Turkey, the Washington Post reported on Wednesday. Haspel, who departed for a secret trip to Turkey on Monday, heard the audio during her visit, according to people familiar with her meetings, said the Washington Post report. A person familiar with the audio said it was compelling and could put more pressure on the United States to hold Saudi Arabia accountable for the death of Khashoggi, the newspaper reported. According to another report published by Turkish newspaper Sağda on Thursday, Turkey also shared with Haspel video recordings related to the murder. After days of denying any knowledge of his whereabouts, Saudi officials last week admitted that Khashoggi was killed in a fistfight at the consulate. The location of Khashoggi's corpse remains unknown. Meanwhile, Sky News reported on Tuesday that the remains of Khashoggi had been found in the garden of the Saudi Consul General's home. Multiple sources suggested Khashoggi had been cut up and his face disfigured, Sky News reported. However, sources in the Istanbul prosecutor's office denied that Khashoggi's remains were found at the Consul General's home, adding that a picture on social media purportedly showing the corpse is fake. President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has said that Turkey would not allow the culprits to get away with savage murder. It is not over yet, Erdogan said. We are unraveling, dismantling the case, and the world is closely following.
Joining us in our studio today is Nicholas Danforth, a senior policy analyst at the Bipartisan Policy Center, and we'll be talking about the latest developments in the murder of dissident Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Good afternoon, Nick. Welcome to Medyascope TV.
Thank you. Wonderful to be here.
So President Erdogan had promised earlier that in his parliamentary group meeting speech on Tuesday, he would reveal the naked truth about the recent murder of dissident Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi. But in the speech didn't really live up to the expectations. It didn't break much new ground. In this speech, Erdogan said that Khashoggi was the victim of a gruesome, premeditated, and political murder, but he didn't say much else. So what do you make of this speech? Why do you think Erdogan decided not to deliver on his promise to reveal the naked truth behind this much talked about murder?
You know, in the weeks leading up to the speech, I think there was a general consensus, certainly in Washington, that the way the Turkish government had handled this, the media side of this case, had been very effective. They'd been gradually releasing details through, anonymous government officials, leaking information to Western media sources, Turkish media sources, leaking some very damning information, some very striking allegations. And the effect of this was, as I assume was intended, to keep the world's interest focused on this, keep the pressure on Saudi Arabia, make it clear that Turkey had very damning evidence, and make it increasingly difficult for Washington or Saudi Arabia, or make it increasingly difficult for Washington to try to sweep this under the rug, as I think Washington might have been eager to. The problem with this approach, I think, is that it was almost too successful. It built up the pressure so effectively that there was no way for Erdogan to follow through with it without releasing audio recordings of the murder, without releasing photographs of the murder, without releasing some really damning clear-cut evidence. And that put him in a difficult situation where I think almost anything he said in his speech would have fallen short of expectations. I think really the only thing he could have done was play the actual audio recording of Khashoggi's murder, which in some ways would have created a whole host of other problems. And again, without knowing what happened behind the scenes, without knowing what the Turkish government's ultimate goal was, and whether concessions were offered, well, I guess we'll get to this in further questions. It's hard to know why necessarily the Turkish government didn't go through with leaking some of the information that it had. But at least by convincing the world that it had it, I think by leaving people with no doubt that there was some really damning evidence that existed, the strategy has nonetheless been successful in making anyone in Washington think twice if they believe that they can make this go away with no consequences.
So let's try to put this into perspective now. Turkey has had a long-standing standing rivalry with the Saudi administration, and its ties with the U.S. Hit a historical low, actually, lately, and this was most visibly so through the case of the imprisoned American pastor Andrew Brunson. So how do you evaluate Turkey's response to the killing of Khashoggi against this backdrop?
Right. No, a lot of people have been asking, doesn't Erdogan risk making a permanent enemy of MBS, of the Saudi government, by going after him like this? And I wonder if that perhaps gets the motivation on the Turkish side backwards, and that I wonder if Turkey sees this, not as something that it's aggressively doing to go after Saudi Arabia, but from Ankar's point of view, that this is a response to what was a very aggressive and provocative affront on the part of the Saudi government against Turkey. And when you look at this in the context of strained U.S.-Turkish ties, I don't want to speculate too much on what the Saudi government's motives were, but one way this certainly could have played out, one way that the Saudi government certainly could have imagined that this would play out, is that they'd commit this murder in Turkey. The Turkish government would be embarrassed by having its sovereignty violated. And yet, if the United States, as seemed entirely possible under Trump, was willing to turn a blind eye to this, it would put Turkey in a very exposed situation where it, because of this rift with the United States, was unable to respond forcefully to the Saudi provocation. And if it tried to do so, would actually increase that rift with Trump and with the United States. So, I think as we were talking about in response to the previous question, the delicate way in which Ankara has managed the information side of this case, I think seems very wise in light of what the Saudi strategy could have been, in that it makes it clear that it's not going to take this lying down. It makes it clear that it's not going to let this go away, but it works with the United States, or it works. The leaks, the presentation of this information puts pressure on the United States to actually have to take action. And so, I think some of the caution that we've seen, possibly including the way Erdogan handled his speech earlier this week, reflects, a very savvy effort on Turkey's part to not get too far out ahead of the United States, to not break with the United States, but rather to try to bring the United States along in showing that it's going to respond, again, to a very provocative and outrageous action on the Saudi government's part.
So this case is receiving a lot of media attention from the world, and in fact, Erdogan's speech on Tuesday was broadcast with Arabic and English subtitles simultaneously. So in a little while, we'll get to how this is being portrayed and received in the American media. But before we do that, let's focus on what's going on in Turkey at the moment. So pro-government Turkish media and columnists have been pointing out from day one at the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, as the main culprit of this murder. But in his parliamentary group speech on Tuesday, Erdogan didn't give any names. He specifically didn't mention MBS, although he focused on MBS's father, King Salman, and said that he did not doubt the sincerity of King Salman. So what's going on here, in your opinion?
No, I mean, that's a good question, and I don't have a great answer for it, unfortunately. But again, as with other aspects of how Erdogan's handled this, there is a sense, the saying is, if you come at the king, you'd best not miss. If if he's really going to personalize this, if he's really going to attack MBS, if he's really going to turn this into an attack on the Crown Prince himself, I think that only makes sense if if Erdogan has some real confidence that this could actually end with the Crown Prince stepping down or being replaced or, being somehow shifted out of the line of succession. And given, again, I'm not an expert on internal Saudi politics. Most of the people speaking on this aren't either. But, barring some evidence that the goal was really to bring down MBS, which I think would be a very ambitious goal, it makes sense to try to leave him an off-ramp, to try to avoid taking this, overly personally. It's interesting thinking about this from the United States point of view. There's always a question on the United States' side. Let's shift track a little bit. Why does Erdogan respond so much more angrily to the United States than he does to, say, Putin? And one of the arguments that people have made is that Erdogan actually thinks the United States at various points has tried to topple him, has tried to bring down his government. And he never feels that way. He's never felt that way about Putin. And so there's a unique sensitivity, I think, that Erdogan is potentially very aware of, that you can go after a country, you can have a confrontation with a country, and there are rules for that. There's a context in which you can do that, and that's how Turkish-Russian relations work. And Putin doesn't try to topple Erdogan, Erdogan doesn't try to topple Putin, and yet if you cross that line, as he may think the United States has, that brings things to a different level. And so I can understand why, looking at that from that context, as much as Erdogan feels the need to respond to Saudi Arabia's provocation, it's possible to imagine that from his perspective, personalizing that, making it about bringing down MBS, would change the rules of the game, would change the context, would have implications that he doesn't want to get into.
So following that very interesting juxtaposition with how Erdogan deals with Trump and Putin, not Trump per se, but
let me add on
other,
a side, actually, because I think it
leaders.
is similar to the way Erdogan deals with Trump, and that you've seen, even when tensions have gotten very high in the United States, or between Erdogan and the United States, he's avoided mentioning Trump. Mm-hmm. And it changed a little bit recently, but he'd talk about, or columnists would talk about the American deep state, or they'd talk about Obama holdovers. But there was that interesting hesitancy to actually personalize it by going after Trump, even though it was clear in many cases it was Trump's policy. So there is an interesting parallel there.
So let's get to the other much speculated item of this week's. It was an eventful week in Turkey. So CIA chief Gina Haspel was in Turkey this week, right. And we were told that she was here to examine intelligence on the murder of Khashoggi. But there are numerous views as to why she visited Turkey, and one of these views holds that she was plainly sent to warn Ankara not to unseat the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. How would you evaluate a view as such?
I mean, it's funny the way that, I'd be curious to know whose view this was and what evidence they had.
It was a piece on Bloomberg, actually.
It was a piece on Bloomberg? Mm-hmm. Who wrote it?
I may be wrong, but for our viewers, I will double-check the piece and
interesting. I should take a look at it.
Yep.
I mean, it's not right to phrase it like that suggests, A, that the United States could tell Turkey not to release this tape, and B, that Turkey, if it wanted to, could bring down the Crown Prince. both of those seem to imply a degree of power, of an ability to give orders that in both cases I'm skeptical of. What I would say, obviously I don't know why the CIA chief was here, no one told me. As we talked about before, there is clearly this effort to coordinate between Washington and Turkey. The United States, I don't think doesn't want Turkey to get too far out ahead of it. Turkey doesn't want to get too far out ahead of the United States, but Turkey has also, I think wants to make it clear to the United States the information that it has, the evidence that it has, and do so in a way that prevents, prevents the United States from ignoring this. And if anything, whatever the Gina Haspel was sent here to tell Turkey, it's also an opportunity for Turkey to tell the United States, look, this is the evidence we have, and possibly say, these are the circumstances in which we're willing to release this evidence, and this is the minimum response we want from you in return for going along with your approach to this issue. So again, has not been the smoothest times for U.S.-Turkish relations, and yet in this case, one would hope that behind the scenes, there's some give and take, there's some communication, and both sides are, however much strain there is, are operating in tandem.
So, as I promised after one of your previous responses, I promised that we would get to how this is being dealt with domestically within the U.S. and how what sort of an impact it's causing in U.S. domestic politics and media. There seems to be an obvious rift within the Republican Party over this issue, and U.S. media also seems to be at odds with Trump on this issue. I mean, just like on many other issues. But regarding this case specifically, so how big or serious of a split are we talking about here? How big of a split is this creating in the U.S. right now?
Well, I mean, maybe it's worth, before we get into that, just stepping back and talking about why this has been such a big deal in the United States in general. And I think we've talked a lot in conversations, Turkey's been involved in it as well, about the nature of the international order, the liberal international order, what's happening to the liberal international order. And we tend to talk in these grandiose terms. But it's interesting when you see these very specific rules that, at least in Washington, that Washington seems to follow, or to expect the world to follow. And they don't always make sense, and they're often hypocritical. But I think there are clear rules, and it's interesting to see how, in this case, I think the Saudi government was unaware of them and ran afoul of them very dramatically and unexpectedly. And is relevant to the Turkish case, because I think Turkey sometimes runs afoul of them in ways that, looking at it from Washington, it seems like people here don't always understand why all of a sudden one thing Turkey does gets a huge reaction from Washington, and another thing that it might be more serious doesn't. And so I think, in the way that looking at the situation in Syria, everyone has been flabbergasted at times by how the international community seems to have a very strict rule that you can't kill people with chemical weapons, but if you want to kill people without chemical weapons, we don't like it, but we're okay with it. And I think the Khashoggi case brings up a very similar arbitrary rule that nonetheless you see how rigorously it's followed in Washington, which is that, if a country, especially a country that's America's ally, wants to murder dissidents, we really don't care. And yet there's you can't do it in a consulate. And that's, on one hand, completely arbitrary. And yet on the other hand, it's the fact that the Saudi government crossed that line, that instead of just, they could have assassinated Khashoggi on a random street in Istanbul. There have been Chechens who've been assassinated in Istanbul. It hasn't been a huge deal. There have been Russian dissidents, former spies, that have been assassinated in London, or now in Salisbury. That's a bigger deal, but it's still not as big a deal as this. There's something about doing it in the consulate that was a dramatic, it caught people's attention. It was a dramatic violation of one of these unspoken international rules. And precisely because of that, if Saudi Arabia had gotten away with it, it would have been a very bold statement. It would have actually been perhaps a very effective statement about the Saudi government's impunity, about the Saudi government's ability to act against people who crossed it in violation of international norms. But in this case, so far at least, it did seem like they went too far, because people in Washington, again, were upset by the manner the killing was done. And also, I think it's fair to say, by who was killed. There's a sense, I believe it was, I'm feeling really bad that I'm going to steal someone else's idea and not be able to give them credit. But it's an excellent idea, and on Twitter I'll remember whose it was. The idea that, in the language of mafia movies, someone like Khashoggi was a made man. Someone, you can kill a lot of people, you can kill a lot of dissidents in your own country, but if you kill a dissident that's well known in Washington, if you kill a dissident that wrote for the Washington Post, that's friends with the Washington foreign policy community, that crosses a different kind of line, and it's because of that Washington has responded so forcefully. And I think, you see that in Turkey. There have been the amount of outrage that's been generated, the amount of articles that have been written about someone like Can Dündar. It's great that there have been. It's good that his case has gotten so much attention. But compared to the many other journalists that are in jail, who people in Washington haven't heard of, there's a clear discrepancy there.
All right, so thank you very much, Nicholas Danforth.
We can keep, I haven't even answered your question.
That was actually
the
end, we have gotten to the end of my questions, but we can
Well, I feel like I didn't
continue
answer your last question. Sorry, I got distracted.
So actually, my question had two parts. One of them was about the domestic politics, meaning what's going on within the Republican Party over the differing views on this case, on the murder of Khashoggi. And the other part was about how the US media is tackling this. So you've addressed the media part, but perhaps we could talk a bit more about how it's making an impact on Republican politics within the party in the US right now.
Right, and I think it's worth noting, in addition to the reasons we just talked about, part of the reason that this has also been picked up by the US media so enthusiastically is that it is a chance to attack Trump. Trump is seen as close to the Saudi government. Trump's son-in-law has been seen as particularly close to MBS. So right, there's an added incentive now to use this as a way to go after Trump. And when Trump was so blatant about dismissing the case, and in a very crass terms said that our priority should be in arms sales to Saudi Arabia, this heightened that impulse to go after him. And at the same time, I think and at the same time, there have been people who've always been deeply uncomfortable with the U.S.-Saudi relationship, who were, have always, going back decades, thought it was uncomfortable that the United States was so deeply in bed with an authoritarian regime. More recently, have been horrified by the Saudi government's war in Yemen, the bombing of innocent people, the starvation. And while I think there are people who thought that's what should have been getting attention, the fact that now finally there was something that did get attention and that did seem to reflect so badly on Saudi Arabia was an opportunity for them to step forward. In addition to all that, the split that you mentioned within the Republican Party has been interesting. There are longtime Saudi apologists, some of whom it's a financial thing, some of whom are actually in one way or another paid by the Saudi government. Others are just believers that this is the United States' interest, that we need a strong relationship with Saudi Arabia to confront Iran for economic reasons as well. What I think this was so blatant, this was such a violation of the rules of behavior, even from our autocratic allies, that it put a lot of Saudi apologists in a very difficult situation. And without saying it explicitly, or in some cases actually saying it explicitly, what a lot of them are saying is the problem with MBS isn't that he's an autocrat. The problem is that he's a tactless autocrat. The problem is he's an autocrat who behaved so irresponsibly that it actually made us look bad. It made it hard for us to continue defending the Saudi government. It embarrassed all of us who are Saudi apologists. And I think it's telling that for a lot of these people, their first instinct was actually to go after Turkey, to go after the Turkish media. And for longtime followers of papers like Yeni Shafak or Daily Sabah, it was remarkable to see these papers being cited as authoritative sources in the US. But at the same time, the Saudi case on this was so preposterous. The Saudi government's lies were so outrageous that we had a remarkable situation where, Daily Sabah looked legitimate by comparison. And so, when all the people who were all the Saudi government's defenders had was to go after Turkish press, and when that was no longer a viable strategy, because again, Saudi gave them so little to work with, I think you eventually got to a point where even longtime believers of the Saudi government thought, at the very least, to maintain our own credibility, and I think to maybe teach MBS that going forward he had to play by the rules. He had to be the right kind of authoritarian ally. They were willing to get on board with a more vigorous, more critical U.S. policy than in other situations they would have. We'll see how far that goes, though. I mean, it's very much developing.
On that note, we could conclude, unless there's something else you'd like to add.
No, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So today we were joined by Nicholas Danforth from the Bipartisan Policy Center, who commented on the most recent developments in the killing of Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi. And we'll continue with our next news video now.
The Nationalist Movement Party, MHP, has announced it will not ally with the ruling Justice and Development Party, AKP, amid a growing row between the two parties over a debate on nationalism and a proposed amnesty law, signaling an end to the People's Alliance they had formed earlier in 2018. We are going to draw up our own plan for the local elections. We are pulling back from our demand for an alliance with the AKP, MHP leader Devlet Bahçeli told his parliamentary group on Tuesday. No alliance can survive if one party is rejected and forced to step back, he added. The MHP and the AKP had formed the People's Alliance for the June 24th presidential and parliamentary elections, which led to the latter's chair, Recep Tayyip Erdogan's election as the first executive president of Turkey. The ties between the two parties have strained recently after the MHP submitted a draft law to parliament for a partial amnesty for some convicts. The AKP strongly reacted against the MHP's move. Another source of tension appeared after Turkey's administrative court ordered the reinstatement of the national oath for schools across Turkey, which had been removed in 2009. While the AKP strongly slammed the courts, the MHP defended it and accused the ruling party of undermining the Turkishness of the country.
President Erdogan has criticized the Council of State over a recent ruling to bring back the national student oath in schools.
President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has criticized the Council of State over a recent ruling to bring back the national oath mandatory for students to chant in schools, saying it bypassed his authority when making the decision. He slammed the Council of State for making the decision now, and not a few years ago, when Turkey wasn't governed by an executive presidency, accusing them of not implementing the separation of powers. The Council of State makes a ruling every 5 years. Where were you in 2013? Why is it that you didn't make a decision in 2013 but are making one now? He told at a symposium on high courts. Erdogan was granted expansive executive powers after receiving a narrow approval in an April 2017 referendum on constitutional changes and the change of the governance system. The old administration ended with the June 24th elections, which put the new system approved in the referendum in practice. Erdogan said, "I have said that the crooked understanding that does not practice the separation of powers and blocks the will of the nation through anti-democratic institutions would be restored. But I ask myself, is it restored? I see some practices that are reminiscent of the old system," Erdogan stated. The Council of State should serve as a consultant body, he said. The presidency should not need to get consent from the Council of State on presidential decree laws, he added. The public will ask the government to give an account of the court rulings, not the justice system, Erdogan said, calling on courts to make immediate and fair rulings. He recalled a tender for a harbor in the Aegean province of Izmir, which he said was delayed due to a court ruling, stressing the state has lost $1 billion because the company had changed its mind due to the court decision. Meanwhile, Council of State Chair Zerrin Güngör said the members of judiciary were always open to scientific criticisms of their verdicts. Speaking at the same gathering, Güngör, however, stressed that voicing an opinion about an ongoing case could shake confidence in the judiciary and the legal system.
Now we'll take a look at what's on in Istanbul next week.
A rising star of the French techno scene, DJ Vitalik will be at the Zorlu PSM studio tonight. Pascal Arbez, or better known by his stage name Vitalik, is a French programmer and multi-instrumentalist who blends electro, techno, and house, as well as elements of classical, rock, Italo disco, and 70s electronic music into a sound that recalls the work of fellow countrymen Daft Punk and Air. Ghost, the musical, is coming to Istanbul soon. Produced by Bill Kenwright and directed by Bob Thompson, the musical toured the UK and embarked on a big international tour in 2018. Ghost, the movie, has been proven to be one of cinema's biggest all-time hits. Starring the late Patrick Swayze, Demi Moore, and Whoopi Goldberg, it was the highest-grossing film of 1990 and won an Oscar for screenwriter Bruce Joel Rubin, who has adapted his screenplay for this musical. Sabancı University Sakıp Sabancı Museum is currently hosting the exhibition Dreaming the Future, Russian Avant-Garde Art and Design, which will be on until April 1st, 2019, featuring a comprehensive anthology of the Russian avant-garde. The exhibition is co-curated by Dr. Nazan Ölçer, head of the museum, and Dr. Maria Çançanoğlu, head of the George Kostakis collection at the State Museum of Contemporary Art in Thessaloniki.
That's all from This Week in Turkey. Thanks for tuning in and hope to see you again next Friday at 5 p.m. Goodbye.